Let's expand our ability to raise exceptions. I have a version of our factorial function here, and it has a little bit of protection, not all the protection we had defined before. But if the user passes in a base that's less than 0, our function raises a value error because factorial is not defined for bases less than 0. And I have a couple print statements here that will test this out. So when I run this, I see that our factorial function correctly evaluates 5 factorial, but raises an exception when we pass -1. Notice that the error actually showed up before the previous value that we know was calculated correctly. You can't really count on the error message being the last thing that pops up in the run window. Okay, so that's great. But what if we wanted to create our own error? Instead of calling this value error, we'd like to call this too low error. And we might want to do that just to get more specific about the problem and give the user more information about what went wrong. Now, I've put off this discussion for this long because we had to talk about classes first. Exceptions are classes. So in order to create a new exception, we have to actually create a new class. So we will define a class called toHighNumber. Usually we put the word error as the last word in the name of our error class. And recall that we discussed the 4 principles of object-oriented design. They were encapsulation, abstraction, polymorphism, and inheritance. We're not going to discuss inheritance in this class, but we talked about the idea that if many classes have a lot of methods and attributes in common, it's good to create a parent class that consolidates all those methods and attributes so you don't have to create them over and over again for each class. We're going to inherit from the exception class by placing the word exception here in parentheses. And again, in this class, we're not going to go into how inheritance works, but just to explain that we are adopting all of the methods and attributes of the exception class without having to type them in again. In fact, there's so much in the exception class that we can just write the word pass, meaning we don't intend to write any new code for this class. All we want is this new name. And that's a complete class that we can use. Instead of value error, we can now raise a toHighNumber error. We run this code, and the message that we get is toHighNumber error. Now for our first try, we just put the word pass inside this class definition, because if we don't put anything, our module won't run. We get the dreaded red lines and red circle. Pass lets the interpreter know that we really don't intend for this to do anything special. But since this is a class, we can actually define methods. For instance, we can define an init method. And in fact, we're actually replacing or overriding the init method that exists in the exception class. And the change that we're going to make here is we are going to take one parameter, and we're going to call that message. And we're going to place the message parameter into the instance attribute of the same name. And then when we raise the exception, we're going to add an argument list and put a friendly message in there. Now, when we run this code and the exception is raised, this message is passed into the constructor and then stored in the instance attribute self.message. This is a special object that gets printed out as part of the error message. Let's try it. So notice that our helpful code got included in the error message here. Please use a non-negative integer for base. And that's because we put it into that special instance attribute self.message. Or if we catch the exception, we could catch it in the usual way. Or we can actually capture the exception object that was created and then print out the friendly message, accessing it from the object problem. You can imagine that we could collect other parameters here and use them as we handle the errors. There you go. Now go forth and raise exceptions, but raise them well. Otherwise, they'll be living at home till they're 30.